In the fall of 1995, you would never know by looking at 17-year-old Diane Zamora that this high school senior from Crowley, Texas, had just made one of the most meaningful and important decisions of her young life. In fact, Diane, dressed in her modest t-shirt and plaid miniskirt and standing quietly in front of her locker at the end of the school day, drew a lot less attention to herself than many of the other teenagers who were now spilling into the noisy hallway all around her. But spinning the numbers on her combination lock, Diane did not feel ordinary. Ever since she had started going out with David Graham 2.5 months earlier, it was like Diane's carefully ordered world had suddenly been knocked into a new orbit. As Diane heard the click of the combination lock release, she tucked her chin down and let her dark curly hair fall forward so it covered her face, giving herself a minute of privacy to think about all that had happened, starting back in the hot and sunny month of August when she and David had first become a couple. There was that moment when both of them looked across the room at one another, and Diane had suddenly felt like they were the only two people in the whole world. And then when David had walked over and casually touched her shoulder, Diane had felt this amazing thrill as she realized this person, who she had known for years as just a friend, had suddenly become something so much more. At first, the feelings that Diane had for David were almost as confusing as they were exciting. Up until that point in her life, having a boyfriend had never been part of Diane's life plan. Diane had spent most of her time over the last 3 years carving out a name for herself as a high academic achiever. Her classmates liked her just fine, but they never expected to see her out drinking or run into her at parties. Instead, Diane was known as a friendly but quiet person who put all of her energy into her schoolwork and other activities that might bolster her academic resume. And that effort and focus had already helped her rack up an impressive list of accomplishments. She had been elected to serve in the student government, she played the flute in the school's marching band, she was a member of the community service organization called Key Club, and she was a member of the National Honor Society, an invitation-only organization made up of academically outstanding high schoolers. And for Diane, all her dedication and hard work had a single purpose. From the time she was 9 years old, Diane had one dream in life. She wanted to be an astronaut. In the 4th grade, she had sent a letter to NASA, which is the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, asking for brochures about their space program and what it took to become an astronaut. And in the years since, her focus on that ambition had never wavered. That is, until now. Almost unconsciously, Diane looked down at her left hand. It was still wrapped in bandages. Back in September, Diane had been driving David's pickup truck on a dark back road when she got into an accident. The truck had flipped over and crushed some of the bones in her left hand. And during the whole time she'd been laid up in the hospital, David had been there for her. And he was there afterward, too, when Diane was back home, struggling with her schoolwork and with the temptation to take too much of her pain medication. Now, standing in the hallway of her high school, Diane wiggled the ring finger of her left hand. Soon the bones would be fully healed and the swelling would go down. And then Diane, feeling her heart start to race, she could start wearing the diamond ring that David had just bought for her. Because, despite having only been dating for 4 weeks, David had recently asked Diane to marry him. And Diane had not hesitated even a second before she said yes. Their wedding date was already set, but it was almost 5 years in the future, August 13th, 2000. They chose this date because it would be when both of them had graduated from college. But even though getting engaged was a big decision for Diane, it wasn't that decision that made Diane feel so different and so special. For Diane, the very meaningful and important decision she had made so very, very recently was to give up her virginity to David. As Diane started packing books into her backpack, she reminded herself that while it had been a very big decision, it had been the right decision. Meanwhile, 18 miles to the west in Mansfield, Texas, Diane's fiancé, David Graham, was also standing in front of his high school locker, and he too was packing the stuff he would need to study that night into his backpack. Like Diane, David was known in his high school for his academic accomplishments, and he was also known for his military ambitions. Even now, at the end of a long day, and with cross-country practice still ahead of him, all 6 feet 2 inches of David's lean body stood ramrod straight. and when a fellow senior heading down the crowded hallway yelled out, "Sup, Colonel Graham?" David just grinned and raised a hand to his forehead in mock salute. He was not one of those aggressive G.I. Joe soldier types. In fact, David had given up football because it just seemed needlessly rough, and he'd taken up cross-country instead. Like Diane at Crowley High School, David was not a part of the in-crowd social scene at his high school. But despite the teasing about his membership in the Junior ROTC and the Junior Civil Air Patrol, David was still known as a pretty cool guy, and an all-around extremely high achiever with exceptionally good manners. Junior ROTC is the U.S. Army's high school equivalent of the Reserve Officer Training Corps, where students who are interested in a military career learn the core values of discipline, citizenship, leadership, character, and community service. And while David was a Junior ROTC battalion commander, his real passion and commitment lay with the Junior Civil Air Patrol. This was a program supported by the U.S. Air Force that also trained teenagers for a military career, with an emphasis on flying and running search and rescue operations. But unlike ROTC, which is geared toward high school students, the Junior Civil Air Patrol accepts teenagers as young as 12 years old, which is how old David was when he first joined. Because like Diane, David had always had one ambition in his life. Ever since first grade, when his dad had taken David to a local air show where the public can go to see different kinds of aircraft and watch amazing displays of aerial acrobatics, David had instantly become obsessed and knew that someday he would become a pilot. And also like Diane, David's dream had only strengthened with each passing year. By the time he was 14, he had his pilot's license, and now, as David headed into his last year of high school, his excellent grades, character references, and junior military service made it a sure bet that after high school, he would be accepted into the prestigious U.S. Air Force Academy out in Colorado Springs, Colorado. As David exchanged a few more greetings with friends and other ROTC members, he also reached into his locker to grab the duffel bag where he kept his cross-country running gear. But instead of going to practice, what David really wanted to do right then was hop in his car and drive out to see Diane in Crowley. But he knew he couldn't. Leaving his school in a tide of other teenagers, David thought back to that evening in early August at a Civil Air Patrol meeting. Like David, Diane had joined the Civil Air Patrol years ago at the age of 14 because she knew that the military was a good way to get the training and qualifications she would need to become an astronaut. But in the first 4 years she had been a member alongside David, the two of them had only been friends, nothing more. But on that particular Tuesday night last August, David just happened to glance over at Diane as she just happened to be glancing over at him, and in this brief moment, they locked eyes, and they both instantly felt attracted to the other. David would later tell his friends that it was like he suddenly saw Diane for what she really was. Incredibly smart, funny, principled, and gorgeous with her dark eyes, full lips, and olive skin. Not that David's fellow cadets needed any telling. They could see right away that something had changed, because that very night, David broke one of the first rules of the Civil Air Patrol Command. As a senior commander in the Civil Air Patrol, David was forbidden to associate with junior cadets, let alone start a romantic relationship with one. But after randomly locking eyes with Diane, David had walked right over to her, put his hand on her shoulder, and then leaned down, and with his mouth pressed close to her ear, he told her she looked very nice tonight. Because of his romantic involvement with Diane, David had to give up his command position in the Civil Air Patrol. But for David, that was a small price to pay in order to be with Diane. And by the end of that month, David was head over heels in love with her. It didn't bother him at all that there was no sex in their relationship because he respected Diane's views on premarital sex. And even after they got engaged to be married, David had no expectations that Diane's views on sex would suddenly change. However, they did. Diane's horrible accident in his pickup truck had cemented the bond between them. And for David, who had only ever had just one serious girlfriend, Diane's sudden decision to make love to him had led to one of the best experiences in his life. David also knew that their relationship had helped both of them cope with some very painful and difficult family problems. This past summer, David and his 3 siblings were shocked and devastated when their parents divorced, and David's mother had been the one to leave home and move away 250 miles south to Houston, Texas. And it was during that same time that Diane had been the one in her family to confront her father about his longtime affair with his mistress. That affair had created so much financial and emotional chaos in the family that her father had lost his job, and for a short but awful period in her life, Diane and her younger sister and brothers became homeless, living out of the family car. But through it all, Diane and David had been there for one another. David had helped pay Diane's expenses, he gave her rides and bought her clothes, and when Diane's family was back on their feet, David practically began living in their new house. And as soon as cross-country practice was over that afternoon, that's exactly where David was headed, to Diane's house, where they would study together until it was dark, and David's father called to tell David it was time for him to come home. When David arrived in Crowley 2.5 hours later, Diane was waiting for him. She gave him one of her big shy smiles, and a few minutes later they were both seated on her worn sofa, their school books spread out all around them. As David drove back home that night in the dark, he reminded himself that the cross-country season would be over in just a month or so. Mansfield High School's team had been good enough that they'd qualified for the regional meet that would be held in Lubbock, Texas on November 3rd and 4th. But David was not really looking forward to this meet. He had no chance of placing in any of the events. He'd have to stay overnight with his teammates in a cramped motel room. Lubbock was more than 300 miles away, and since Diane's high school, Crowley High School, had not qualified for the regional meet, Diane would be staying home. David had friends on his team that he could spend time with during the meet, but he wished Diane was going to be there. A few weeks later, and the regional meet in Lubbock, Texas, wound up happening pretty much as David had expected. But at least when it was all over, David and Diane had more time they could spend together. From that Thanksgiving onward, David and Diane's respective families both watched with pride as the young couple seemed to turn the last 7 months of their final year at high school into a victory lap that had them circling together around a shining future. By early spring, David had received word that he'd been selected as a candidate for the U.S. Air Force Academy out in Colorado Springs. And on the same exact day, Diane received her letter of acceptance from the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, along with a full scholarship that covered tuition and room and board in exchange for 4 years of military service after she graduated. As high school graduation rolled around in May of 1996, Diane was recognized as one of the most accomplished seniors at Crowley High School, while David was one of the most celebrated seniors at Mansfield High School. And when the students at Mansfield stood up to give David a standing ovation, Diane was right there in the audience clapping as hard as she could, just as David was at Crowley High School when Diane received her awards and diploma. For students and administrators at both schools, these award ceremonies were welcome moments of celebration, because in the past several months, big city problems, drugs, gangs, and violence had started creeping into the once safe and secure borders of both Mansfield and Crowley. Ever since January, the residents of Dallas and Fort Worth, where Diane lived, had been following the tragic news of a child kidnapping that had led to the brutal murder of the 9-year-old hostage, a little girl with shoulder-length blonde hair whose missing person picture had been plastered all over the city. And 5 months into the investigation, and the little girl's murderer had still not been caught. Meanwhile, Mansfield had suffered its own very personal tragedy. In early December, a local farmer had found the body of a high school sophomore in his abandoned field. She had been murdered, and her death had sent shockwaves through the 15,000 residents of Mansfield and the 2,500 high school students who had been her classmates. In the 3 weeks it took local detectives to make an arrest, the school and the town had buzzed with rumors as police tried to sort through the complicated and secret life of a popular and talented teenager. For Diane and David, the combined news of these tragedies made their own worries and problems, mostly their upcoming separation as they headed off to opposite sides of the country for college, seem completely insignificant. So, after the high school awards ceremony, when David and Diane were interviewed by local reporters about their accomplishments and future plans, they told them that there were a lot worse things in life than a long-distance relationship. especially given the strength of their commitment to one another. When the news article was published 10 days later in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, the headline read, "Couple to march to military drums, then wedding bells." And at the start of the summer of 1996, David and Diane put that commitment to the test. On Friday, June 30th, David headed 700 miles northwest to the U.S. Air Force Academy, its 18,000-acre campus located in the remote foothills of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado Springs, Colorado. 2 days later, on Sunday, July 2nd, Diane headed 1,400 miles east to the United States Naval Academy, its 338-acre campus perched on the edge of the Chesapeake River and fully enveloped by the historic city of Annapolis, Maryland. And from the very start of their military education and training, it was Diane who had the most trouble adjusting to the physical challenges and also to the emotional stress of being separated from David. Unlike David, who was actually motivated by the structure and discipline of the military, Diane struggled to fit in socially and to embrace the command structure that put freshmen like herself at the bottom of the totem pole. Meanwhile, that old injury to her left hand from the car accident had made the daily grind of endless push-ups, squats, bear crawls, and other calisthenics not only difficult, but very painful. 5 weeks in, and David, out in Colorado, had become an official Air Force cadet, ready to start the 4-year run to becoming an Air Force pilot. 5 weeks in for Diane, and she was showing alarming and troubling signs of psychological strain. While her letters back home painted a very rosy picture of success and determination, the reality of her situation could not have been more different. Without David, it was like Diane's life was falling apart. According to her squad leader, a freshman named Jason Guild, Diane was only barely making it through the 6-week boot camp at the Naval Academy. She wrote constant emails to David, and when he didn't reply right away, she'd break down into uncontrollable fits of crying. In her required essay, where she was supposed to talk about herself and her ambitions, all she wrote about was David and their engagement. Diane was also starting to withdraw socially. She refused to participate in a program that matched new cadets with local families to help cadets adjust to the stresses of being newcomers at the academy. Diane's supervising officers warned her that she was becoming way too much of a loner and that she was losing her focus and only just meeting the minimum expectations. And when Diane did engage with other people, all she talked about was David. But along with telling anyone who would listen how much she and David loved each other, Diane also talked about David like maybe she didn't fully trust him. But it was Diane, not David, who seemed open to getting involved with someone else, and who dangled that possibility in front of David like a red flag in front of a bull when she told him she was interested in her squad leader, Jason Guild. And when Diane called David to tell him that Jason had kissed her, David immediately sent Jason a threatening email telling him to leave Diane alone. Diane responded with a deluge of emails and letters and more phone calls to David that were equal parts lovesick and angry. Meanwhile, when she was with Jason and her friends, Diane veered back and forth between begging Jason to be her boyfriend and, in the next breath, declaring her undying devotion to David. At first, Diane's roommates assumed that Diane's erratic behavior was caused by the stress of trying to maintain a long-distance relationship with her fiancé. But halfway through boot camp, Diane really seemed to come totally unhinged. It was at that point in early August that Diane took her roommates aside and began to point out all these small scars all over her body. And then she began to hint at something very dark in her relationship with David. And finally, in the early morning hours of Sunday, August 25th, one day after officially making it through her 6-week boot camp, Diane didn't just hint at this dark thing. She came right out and told her roommates the whole story. Completely shocked by what they had just heard, Diane's fellow cadets knew they could not keep silent. But what Diane had said was also just so unbelievable that her roommates weren't sure if Diane had actually just made the whole thing up for some reason. So instead of reaching out directly to an academy officer, the cadets went to the academy chaplain, whose job was to offer spiritual and moral guidance. They figured he could decide how to handle the information. 5 days later, on Friday, August 30th, 4 investigators from the outer suburbs of Dallas and Fort Worth, Texas, arrived in the main administration building of the U.S. Naval Academy. Surrounded by the naval officials who had been contacted by the academy chaplain, the detectives had made the 1,400-mile trip for only one reason. They were there to talk with former Texas resident Diane Zamora. It would turn out all the stress Diane had felt since arriving at the Naval Academy was caused by something much more sinister and disturbing than just Diane's separation from David. Instead, Diane's strange and troubling behavior had been caused by a dark secret that Diane and David had been keeping for a very long time. But to understand what this dark secret was, we have to go back almost 9 months to late November of 1995, when David and Diane were both still seniors in high school. That was the weekend of the cross-country regional meet in Lubbock, Texas, the same regional meet that David had been really bummed about because Diane would not be attending. During the long 5-hour bus ride to and then from Lubbock, David had struck up a friendly conversation with a fellow Mansfield High School student, a young woman who was one of the best runners on the girls' team. And when the bus had finally returned to Mansfield after the meet was all over, this same girl asked David if he could give her a ride home from where they had just been dropped off, which was out front of Mansfield High School. David agreed, but instead of driving straight to her house, he and his new friend made an unplanned detour to a parking lot behind a local elementary school, and not long after parking, the pair had climbed into the back seat of David's car and they had sex. By then, it was a well-known fact at Mansfield High School, where David went to school, that he was engaged. And maybe if Diane had also been a student at Mansfield, she might have found out about David's infidelity. But she didn't, because no one at her school, Crowley High School, had heard about what David had done. So Diane had no idea he had cheated on her. And so over the course of the days that followed David's sexual encounter with the star runner, Diane just acted normal, talking endlessly to David about the purity and sanctity of their love for one another. And day after day, David's guilt over what he had done felt heavier and heavier until he just couldn't stand it any longer. And so finally, on Friday, December 1st, 1995, a few days after spending Thanksgiving with Diane and her family, David told Diane that he had cheated on her. Diane was beyond devastated. Even though the thought of David with someone else was unbearable for Diane to think about, she couldn't stop herself from making David repeat over and over and over again all the little details of the sexual encounter. And the more Diane heard, the more wild and upset she became. To Diane, her virginity had been very precious, a gift that she could only ever give one time. And now David had repaid that gift by cheating on her. When crying and screaming did nothing to make her feel any better, Diane grabbed a fireplace iron and tried to hit David. After David grabbed the iron and took it away from her, Diane turned away from him and just started banging her head against the wall. Over the next couple of days, David and Diane spent hours talking to one another about what happened, but especially for Diane, there was just no way to go back to how she used to feel about David. And for David, along with his sense of guilt, there was something else. He was starting to have conflicting emotions about his relationship with Diane. And so, on the night of Sunday, December 3rd, just 48 hours after coming clean to Diane, David slowly picked up the family telephone in his home and he dialed a phone number and then put the receiver to his ear. A minute later, David heard the familiar voice of 16-year-old Adrienne Jones, the smart, bubbly, blonde star runner of the Mansfield High School cross-country team that David had had sex with in the back of his car. After talking for only a few minutes, Adrienne agreed to sneak out of her house later that night and meet up with David. Like David, Adrienne was an excellent student who talked about becoming a veterinarian after she finished high school. But Adrienne also had a rebellious streak, and while she did not have a reputation as someone who slept around, she did enjoy a little bit of flirting and attention from the opposite sex. And while she hadn't told any of her friends about her earlier hookup with David, she decided that if he ever asked her out again, she'd say yes. So by 12:30 a.m., Adrienne was looking out her window, anxiously waiting for David to arrive. And even though David wound up being 2 hours late, pulling up the driveway close to 2:30 a.m., Adrienne was still wide awake and happy to see him. As soon as she heard the sound of his car engine on her street, Adrienne turned on her light so she could give herself one final quick look in the mirror. She was wearing her favorite plaid shorts and t-shirt. Then she switched off the light, made her way quietly down the stairs, and slipped out the back door. After Adrienne climbed into the front passenger seat of the Mazda hatchback, David smiled and apologized for being late. Then he turned the car northwest, and they drove along quiet, dark roads until they reached their destination, a large recreation center just over the Mansfield line in the small town of Grand Prairie. Once they arrived, David turned off the car engine. The night was clear and the moon was almost full. To one side of the car, they could see the lake that was part of the recreation center. On the other side of the car, they could see a large empty field fenced off on all sides. Even though the night air was cool, Adrienne had rolled down her window and a slight breeze ruffled her thick blonde hair. For just a minute, David sat in the driver's seat without moving. He knew what he was about to do was wrong. But before he could change his mind, he turned toward Adrienne and reached across the space between them. As she began to lean toward David, he ran his hands along her arms and then up over her shoulders towards her neck. And then, taking a deep breath, David suddenly closed his strong hands around Adrienne's throat and gave her neck a violent jerk. For just a second, Adrienne sat there stunned, and then her hands shot up to her neck as she tried to grab David's fingers and pull them away. But as she did this, David only tightened his grip, readjusting himself in his seat, and then he began twisting her neck first to one side and then to the other. Within seconds, Adrienne's complete and total shock gave way to a massive rush of adrenaline. And with all of her strength, she grabbed his arms and stopped the violent side-to-side motion, and then began forcing her much larger attacker back away from her. And it was while she was grappling with David that Adrienne heard a sudden noise coming from the backseat of the car. All at once, she felt David's hands loosen, and they both turned towards the sound. Suddenly, there was a third person in the car with them, a small, slender girl with dark hair and dark eyes. Even as Adrienne registered in some part of her brain that this must be David's fiancée, Diane Zamora, Adrienne felt the blinding pain of a sudden blow to the side of her head. Dazed, but knowing she was in a fight for her life, Adrienne twisted in her seat away from David, away from Diane, and somehow managed to open the car door, and she fell out onto the ground. But as Adrienne scrambled to her feet, she felt another blow to her head in the same spot, this one even harder. Despite the pain, Adrienne still managed to pull herself up onto her feet again, and seconds later she was half staggering, half running towards the open field ahead of her. But before Adrienne made it to the fence, she could feel her strength starting to ebb. With one last lurch, Adrienne threw herself up and over the 4 strands of the barbed wire fence. But even as she made it to the other side, her sock caught on the barbs, and she stumbled forward and kind of twisted and landed on her back, her bloody face looking up at the bright Texas moon. Off in the distance, there was the sound of raised voices, and then a few minutes later, David stood in the field looking down at Adrienne, a 9mm Russian-made Makarov pistol in one of his hands. David raised the gun and aimed it at Adrienne's face, and then he fired it twice. One round hit Adrienne just below her left eye, the other round hit her square in the forehead, right between her eyes. In the last moment of her life, Adrienne's hand clutched convulsively into a fist, and her fingers wrapped themselves around a handful of stiff winter grass. 40 minutes later, in the town of Burleson, 20 miles to the west, 16-year-old Jay Green heard a knock on his bedroom window. It was long past midnight, but this was a routine that had played out many times before between Jay and his best friend from the Junior Civil Air Patrol, David Graham. Except this time, when Jay removed the screen from the window to let his friend inside, it wasn't just David standing there. Instead, 2 people tumbled into the room, landing at Jay's feet. In the faint glow of green and red lights from the plastic Christmas tree set up in the corner of his bedroom, Jay looked down to see David and Diane lying together on the floor, arms wrapped tightly around each other. It looked like there was something dark and liquid spattered on their clothes and faces and hands. When Jay asked David what was going on, David looked up at him and said, "You don't want to know. Don't ask any questions. We were never here. This never happened." A few minutes later, David and Diane went into Jay's bathroom and spent 30 minutes cleaning up. When they came back out, David asked Jay if he could borrow some clean clothes. An hour after that, David and Diane made the 4-mile drive from Jay's house back to Diane's house in Crowley. When David's father called the Zamora's house later that morning to make sure David was up and going to school, he asked his son if he'd heard about that girl from Mansfield that was just found dead in a local farmer's empty field. David said no, then he hung up the phone and stared at Diane in silence. It would turn out, a week earlier when David confessed to Diane that he had had sex with Adrian Jones, Diane had been so furious at David that when he asked her how he could make things between the two of them right again, Diane had told him there was only one way that was going to happen. David would have to kill Adrian. At first, David was stunned by her request, but feeling like he somehow had to avenge Diane's honor, he ultimately agreed to do it. So, beginning early on Sunday, December 3rd, as Diane watched and listened, David started placing calls to Adrian. When he finally reached her, it was about 10:30 p.m. that night. Adrian was on the phone with her boyfriend at the time David called, and Adrian's mother was waiting nearby to make sure Adrian did not stay up too late talking on the phone. Adrian interrupted her call with her boyfriend, whose name was Tracy, to take the incoming call from David. And a few minutes later, she had agreed to meet David that night. Diane told David in no uncertain terms that there was no way she was going to let David meet with Adrian alone. So, after making their preparations, David got behind the wheel of the Zamora family car, and Diane crawled into the trunk space of the car. And because this car was a hatchback, the trunk was not separated from the seating area. Meaning, if you were in the back seat of this car, you could just turn around and look into the trunk. David's plan was to kill Adrian by breaking her neck. But, just in case that didn't work, he had brought along his 9mm pistol. Additionally, he had brought a set of heavy round barbell weights that he would use to sink Adrian's dead body in the nearby lake out at the recreation center, where he planned to take Adrian. David packed both the gun and the weights in a duffel bag, and then he put that bag in the trunk next to where Diane was going to be hiding. But it turned out, in David's words, that snapping someone's neck was a lot harder than it looks in the movies. Within minutes of David stopping the car near the recreation center, nothing had gone according to the plan that he had worked out with Diane. When Diane peeked her head up and over the back seat and saw David struggling to break Adrian's neck, Diane dug into the duffel bag next to her and pulled out one of David's weights. Then Diane climbed from the trunk space up and over the back row of seats until she was right behind the front seat where Adrian was fighting for her life. As Diane got into position, Adrian and David heard her, and for a second they both just kind of stopped and turned around to look back toward her. And in this brief second that Adrian is registering that Diane is sitting in the car with them, Diane wound up with that weight and slammed it into the side of Adrian's head. But amazingly, this did not kill Adrian. Adrian somehow managed to get out of the car despite her head being caved in on one side, and then she began running towards the field. But Diane leapt out of the car, chased her down, and slammed her again as she was running in the exact same spot on the side of her head, further crushing her skull. But still, amazingly, Adrian, probably just fueled by adrenaline, kept on moving towards the field. But when she tried to clear the fence, she had gotten stuck on one of the barbs and landed on her back, and she couldn't move, and she had no more strength left, and so she just lay there staring up at the moon, wondering what was going to happen to her. By this point, Diane had gone back to the car, but David had grabbed his pistol and charged into the field after Adrian. But when he looked down at her and saw her on the ground with her head caved in and she wasn't moving, he just turned around and walked back to the car and told Diane that Adrian was dead. But Diane was taking no chances, and after kind of peering over David's shoulder in Adrian's direction, she thought she saw Adrian moving, and so she told David, "Go finish the job." A minute later, David had walked back over to the field and was looking down at Adrian, who was very much alive. Her breath was shallow, but she was laying there looking up at him, her eyes wide open, and David just raised his gun and he fired it twice into her face. When Diane and David got back into the car to drive to Jay Green's house to wash the blood off of their clothes and bodies, the first words David said to Diane were, "I love you, baby. Do you believe me now?" In response, Diane answered, "Yes, I believe you. I love you too." In the 5 weeks that followed Adrian's death, Adrian's mother, Linda Jones, told police that on the night before Adrian's body was discovered, she overheard her daughter talking to 2 different boys. Adrian had been talking to her boyfriend, Tracy, who had a rock-solid alibi for the time of the murder, when Adrian had interrupted that conversation to take an incoming call from another boy before switching back to her call with her boyfriend. When Linda asked her daughter that night who the second caller was, Adrian had told her that it was a boy named David from the cross-country team. But even with that tidbit of information, detectives never seriously considered David as a possible suspect. Because, according to Adrian's boyfriend, Tracy, Adrian had told him that that incoming call she had received was from a boy named Brian, a guy who sometimes followed Adrian around and hung out at the Golden Fried Chicken drive-thru where Adrian worked. What no one knew at the time was that Adrian had lied to her boyfriend about the identity of the second caller, most likely because she didn't want her boyfriend to ask any questions about David. During the initial murder investigation, when police did ask David if he called Adrian the night of her murder, David simply lied and said, "No, why would I do that?" David then told police that he had an alibi for the night of the murder, that he and his fiancée, Diane, had spent December 3rd and 4th with one another at her house. Taking David at his word, detectives assumed that Linda must have misheard what her daughter had said. And so the police began operating on the idea that what Adrian's boyfriend had been told by Adrian, that Brian was the caller, was the truth. And before long, investigators had zeroed in on Brian as their main suspect. And once they found out that Brian had been paying a lot of unwanted attention to Adrian, they arrested him. But after holding Brian in jail for 3 weeks, police could not find any hard evidence that linked Brian to the killing. After failing to break Brian's alibi, and after Brian passed a lie detector test, police released the traumatized 17-year-old. And after that, the Adrian Jones murder case went cold. But that would change in August of 1996, just 2 months after Diane and David got their standing ovations at their high school graduations and headed off to 2 of the most prestigious military academies in the world. Because there, at the U.S. Naval Academy, separated from David and consumed with guilt, and also with suspicion that David might cheat on her again, Diane began to draw back the curtain on what her relationship with David had truly been like in the months after Adrian's gruesome murder. The scars on her body that she showed her classmates were from David. According to Diane, David had beat her and stabbed her and wrapped a belt around her neck and pulled it tight. And apparently, Diane had done similar things to David, and he had marks all over his body as well. While the image David and Diane presented to the world was that of a golden couple utterly devoted to one another, in private, they had started to physically as well as emotionally torture each other over this terrible secret they both shared. And finally, on August 14th, Diane came out and told her roommates exactly what that secret was. That almost 9 months earlier, back in December of 1995, she and David had killed 16-year-old Adrian Jones. And as soon as Diane's roommates passed that information on to the military chaplain, he had informed the attorney for the Naval Academy, at which point naval officers had called the police department in Mansfield, Texas, and told them they needed to come out and talk to one of their students. When Texas investigators arrived in Annapolis on August 30th to question Diane about Adrian's murder, Diane denied everything, saying that the entire story she had told her roommates was just a Texas tall tale, something she had made up in an effort to get her roommates' attention. But when investigators flew out to the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado to question David, David's initial denial that he had had anything to do with Adrian's death did not hold up for very long. By that time, investigators had tracked down Jay Green, who told them about the bizarre visit he'd received from Diane and David in the early hours of December 4th. And when he was ordered, not asked, by Air Force officials to take a lie detector test, David failed. A couple of days later, on the night of Thursday, September 5th, David sat down at a word processor in a small room at the U.S. Air Force Academy Administration Building and typed out and then signed a 4.5-page confession. In it, he wrote that when his, quote, precious relationship with Diane was damaged by his, quote, thoughtless actions, which is how he described his sexual encounter with Adrian, the only thing that could satisfy Diane's, quote, womanly vengeance was for David to kill the girl who had, for an instant, taken Diane's place in David's life. Confronted with David's confession, Diane quickly responded with her own formal statement that corroborated much of what David had already told investigators. And immediately after both of them had been arrested and charged with capital murder, David and Diane continued to defend each other and declare their love for one another both publicly and through the many letters they wrote back and forth. But by the time Diane's case went to trial a couple of years later, in early February of 1998, David and Diane had not only recanted their confessions, they had also turned on each other. Diane portrayed herself as an innocent party who had been abused and manipulated by David, and it was David who actually murdered Adrian Jones. The jury did not buy Diane's story, and on February 17, 1998, Diane was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. 5 months later, when David's case came to trial, defense attorneys argued that David had been pressured by investigators to confess to Adrian's murder. But the jury disagreed, and on July 24, 1998, David was also found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison as well. Unlike Diane, David has expressed remorse for his role in the brutal murder of Adrian Jones, and he has said his punishment fits the crime. Both David and Diane will be eligible for parole in 2036.
A hot, muggy morning in June of 1914, a 40-year-old physician named Joseph G. Goldberger stepped down from his horse-drawn carriage right out in front of a palatial brick building in rural Georgia. He was impressed, but also confused by the grandiose architecture. It looked more like a state capitol than what it really was, a mental hospital. The doctor shielded his eyes from the sun and loosened his collar and fanned his face with a stack of papers as sweat poured down his body. He had traveled all over the world in his work for the United States Public Health Service, but he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt heat this oppressive. He hoped that once he got inside, it would be a bit cooler. So Dr. Goldberger paid the carriage driver, grabbed his bags, and then marched right up the steps into the front office of the Georgia State Sanitarium for the Insane. The doctor was there on direct orders from the United States Surgeon General to investigate a skin disease called pellagra that was ravaging the American South. The word pellagra was Italian for rough or dry skin, but that name totally understates the danger of this condition. People sometimes called pellagra the disease of the 4 Ds, referring to how it progresses: dermatitis, then diarrhea, then dementia, and then finally death. Until the past decade, there had rarely been a case of pellagra in the United States, but in recent years, it had arrived with a vengeance. And now it was an epidemic. In the American South alone, there were at least 100,000 confirmed cases of pellagra. The U.S. Public Health Service had only been studying pellagra for about 5 years, so they hadn't been able to determine its cause yet, but the leading theory was that it was spread by a type of black fly that feeds on blood. And if that was true, Dr. Goldberger knew he was taking a huge risk coming here. He could get pellagra too. But Dr. Goldberger had been taking risks ever since he was a child, when his family emigrated from Hungary to New York without a cent to their name. And now he was one of the most distinguished physicians in the U.S. Public Health Service, and he had investigated outbreaks of yellow fever, typhus, dengue fever, Schamberg's disease, and typhoid fever, just to name a few. Nearly every time, he'd caught the disease he was fighting. But Dr. Goldberger was a man on a mission. He had to know why there was such a concentration of pellagra cases at places where people lived in large groups, like old age homes, prisons, orphanages, and mental asylums. He decided to start his research at this sanitarium in Georgia, one of the largest mental hospitals in the world with over 3,000 patients, many of which had pellagra. Once the doctor entered the vaulted 4-story entrance hall, he shook hands with the head nurse and explained his plan. He wanted to interview the most advanced pellagra patients first, since they had the most symptoms to study. The nurse led Dr. Goldberger out of the main building, around a fountain, and down a tree-lined road to a 3-story building. She explained that the sanitarium was segregated by gender and race. She was taking him to where the white male patients were kept. They were some of their worst pellagra cases. The doctor followed as she led the way up some stairs and then down a long hallway lined with doors. Moans and babbling voices echoed off the stone walls. Dr. Goldberger glanced through the circular windows on each door as they passed. Patients were crowded several to a room, often with widely differing conditions, from alcoholics to senile old men to people suffering violent psychotic episodes. Some of the patients were there voluntarily, but others were basically prisoners who had been brought against their will. Dr. Goldberger had seen plenty of human suffering throughout his career, but the misery of these men was still hard to witness. Eventually, they stopped at a heavy wooden door. The nurse removed a key from her ring, then unlocked the door and held it open for the doctor. Inside the cramped, low-ceiling room, a tired-looking man sat on a narrow cot. The nurse said he was a local cotton farmer named Henry, and he had one of the worst cases of pellagra at the hospital. Dr. Goldberger flinched at the sharp smell of sweat and body odor inside of the room, and also at the farmer's appearance. His appearance reminded the doctor of medical photos he'd seen of leper colonies in India. The farmer's neck, hands, forearms, and feet were crusted over in this splotchy black mass. As the doctor stepped closer, he could see that the blackness was caused by scabbed-over blood from popped sores. The room was hot and stuffy. The only ventilation was a small window on the far wall. If pellagra was contagious, this was a terrible place to visit an infected patient. But Dr. Goldberger was determined to get to the bottom of this, so he braced himself for the danger ahead and then confidently walked over to the farmer and shook the man's hand. Dr. Goldberger said hello to Henry and asked to hear his story. Henry nodded and then told the doctor that he had admitted himself to the sanitarium a few months ago. At first, Henry thought the rash on his body was just a sunburn, but the rash had continued to spread even when he was out of the sun, and then when the strange, prickly feeling spread to his mouth, he realized this had to be something worse than just a sunburn. He was worried about his wife and his kids catching whatever he had, so he had come here. And this wasn't all. Henry now suffered from near-constant diarrhea. He couldn't sleep much or taste food, and his motor skills were deteriorating. He sighed and said he knew there wasn't anything to be done. The staff had told him that since the cause of pellagra still was not known, that meant there weren't any proven treatments. There was very little they could do to help him. Dr. Goldberger asked Henry to stand up so he could examine him. But when the farmer tried to get up, his legs were so shaky he had to immediately sit back down. Dr. Goldberger was shocked to see firsthand what this disease could do to the human body in just a few months. Henry slowly raised his head to look at the doctor. His eyes had trouble focusing, and he spoke in a cracked voice as he explained his situation. His wife was too busy with their kids to actually manage the farm, and so every day Henry was here at the sanitarium was another day they were not able to tend to their crops. And if he was gone much longer, they would lose everything. Dr. Goldberger stared back at Henry and promised him that he would not stop until he discovered what caused his illness. After leaving Henry's room, Dr. Goldberger followed the nurse on a tour of the rest of the sanitarium. He interviewed dozens of men and women of different ages and races. Each case was tragic in its own way. Pellagra was relentless once it took hold. Seeing children covered in painful sores broke Dr. Goldberger's heart. It seemed like there was nothing anybody could do to help them. But what puzzled Dr. Goldberger the most was just how erratic this disease was. It didn't make sense to him why the pellagra hadn't spread further. In these hot, unventilated buildings, he would have thought entire wards would have caught it by now if it was contagious, but only a fraction of the residents were sick. That night, as Dr. Goldberger went over his notes in his room, he realized that the next step was to interview the staff, all 293 of them. The following morning, Dr. Goldberger was given a vacant office to conduct his interviews. He made sure the survey he would give each staff member was very thorough: how long each person had worked at the sanitarium, which ward they were stationed in, what their interactions had been with every patient, as well as everything about their daily routine. One after another, the staff came in, introduced themselves, and patiently answered every question, and all of them were smiling and very helpful. And for some reason, something just didn't seem right to Dr. Goldberger. An hour into the process, it struck him. None of the staff were sick in the slightest. These were people who worked in buildings full of patients with pellagra, yet none of them showed even a single symptom of having caught the disease. This made Dr. Goldberger wonder, was pellagra really contagious? The prevailing medical theory was that pellagra was an infectious bacteria carried by insects that spread the disease with their bites. If that theory was right, then why were these insects only infecting patients and not the staff? Black flies looking for blood will bite anyone. Dr. Goldberger suspected that something else besides black flies must be causing this disease. In fact, he wondered if pellagra was really an infectious disease at all. He almost laughed out loud with relief. This might be the first time in his career of fighting epidemics that he himself did not get sick. And so if this theory Dr. Goldberger was thinking about was correct, then it was totally useless to make people sick with pellagra stay in isolation. The much more important task was trying to figure out what was causing the pellagra in all these people. Thankfully, the hospital had a telephone. Once Dr. Goldberger wrapped up his interviews with the staff, he called the Surgeon General and received permission to continue his investigation. Dr. Goldberger wanted to inspect another hotbed of pellagra outbreaks, this time at an orphanage in Jackson, Mississippi. And as Dr. Goldberger headed to his room to pack, one of the nurses pulled him aside. She said she had bad news. Henry, the local cotton farmer, had just been found dead inside of his room. Dr. Goldberger shook his head. He wondered how many more people like Henry would die before he could figure out what was causing this horrible disease. Two days later, Dr. Goldberger hurried toward the entrance of the Methodist Orphan Asylum in Jackson, Mississippi, hoping to get out of the blinding sun. He hadn't thought it possible, but somehow it felt even hotter here than in Georgia. And the stakes were a lot higher here, too. Here, the people suffering were children. Children who had no families to comfort them. The orphanage looked far more welcoming than the imposing sanitarium. It reminded Dr. Goldberger of a small country church, with an arched entryway and 2 bell towers above. Inside, the matron who ran the orphanage introduced herself and showed the doctor to his guest quarters in the visitors' wing. After putting away his things, he followed her on a tour of the building. Despite the building's friendly exterior, Dr. Goldberger realized the place needed serious maintenance. As the matron showed him around, he could see cracks in the ceiling, and the bathrooms smelled swampy, like they'd recently flooded or had plumbing problems. The staff was also quite small compared to the number of kids they were caring for, but the kids were relatively well behaved and happy. The doctor poked his head in one of the dormitories and noticed the majority of the beds were made. When they approached the hospital ward, the matron warned Dr. Goldberger to brace himself for a very unpleasant sight. The ward was a long, low room lined with narrow beds, almost like an army barracks. Fully 1/3 of the orphanage, 68 kids, were isolated here because they all had signs of pellagra. In some kids, the pellagra rash had spread up their neck and onto their face. As Dr. Goldberger followed the matron through the room, a particularly sad-looking girl, who looked to be about 8 years old, caught his eye. She was sitting cross-legged on her bed, holding a book. Dr. Goldberger noticed stripes of red sores creeping out beneath the cuffs of her sleeves. The doctor sat down next to her and asked how she was feeling. The girl said she couldn't sleep anymore because her body constantly itched all over, and whenever she scratched it, her skin burned like it was on fire. She peeled back the collar of her shirt to show him. Her neck was ringed in a dark, scaly rash. Dr. Goldberger patted her hands and told her to stay strong. He was going to do everything he could to help her. She nodded, but she did not seem convinced. As Dr. Goldberger looked around the ward, he realized that nearly all of the kids were within a couple of years of this little girl's age. He saw almost no preschoolers or teenagers, even though the orphanage provided homes for kids from birth to age 18. Dr. Goldberger was puzzled, but he kept his thoughts to himself. Dr. Goldberger stood up and followed the matron outside to where a group of older children were helping build a storage shed. The matron explained to the doctor that that was today's chore. As Dr. Goldberger watched these teenagers sawing and hammering planks of wood out in the sun, he was struck by the contrast between them and all the younger children inside the hospital ward. These older kids looked so happy and healthy, and none had even the faintest sign of pellagra. The doctor jotted down some observations in his notebook and then followed the matron to their final stop, the nursery. Inside, it was loud and crowded, with infants and small children scattered all about. Some were playing with blocks and old weathered toys, while others napped on cots. The room felt hot and chaotic, but as Dr. Goldberger studied these kids, he couldn't see any signs of sickness. They were just maybe a bit dirty, like you'd expect active kids to be, and so it comforted Dr. Goldberger to see some signs of normalcy here. After dinner, the doctor stayed up for a while organizing his research. He was beginning to see strange patterns in who got pellagra and who didn't. At the sanitarium in Georgia, pellagra had struck people from every age group, from grandparents to young kids. But here, at this orphanage, all the pellagra patients were the same age group, between 6 and 12. This was new. He'd never encountered a disease before that only affected people of certain ages. Dr. Goldberger now felt confident pellagra was not spread by black flies, but he had a new riddle to solve. Why would infants and older kids not get pellagra while the kids in the middle of those two groups were getting so sick? Dr. Goldberger laid in bed, thinking in circles and listening to the drone of cicadas outside. But he couldn't sleep. He just couldn't get those faces of the kids in the sick ward out of his mind. The next morning, Dr. Goldberger woke up early, gathered his notes, and called a meeting with the matron. He wanted to know every detail of how the kids at the orphanage were cared for, from daily activities to sleeping arrangements to meals. The matron explained that they tried to make the kids' lives as normal as possible, but it had grown more difficult in recent years because of cutbacks to the orphanage's funding. The staff had been forced to ration the more expensive foods. For instance, now only the youngest kids were given milk, because it was essential to their growth, while all the other kids went without it. The staff had also begun assigning chores to the older kids. The orphanage needed constant repairs, but because of these cutbacks, they could no longer afford to hire outside help. And so in exchange for their labor, the older kids were given bigger and better meals, including meat and vegetables, at least once a week. By comparison, the kids in the middle, between ages 6 and 12, ate mostly cornmeal with molasses. On rare occasions, they got whatever low-quality meat the orphanage could scrounge up. They got almost no milk or vegetables at all. Dr. Goldberger was stunned. The kids in the 6 to 12 group were not getting enough to eat, and they were overwhelmingly the ones getting pellagra. Of course, he knew that a bad diet could lead to health complications, but it didn't make sense that it would cause something as horrible as pellagra. The doctor then asked the matron if there were any kids in the 6 to 12-year-old age range who showed no signs of pellagra. Unfortunately, almost all of the kids in that middle age group had at least some symptoms of pellagra. But then she smiled and said actually there were a few kids in that age group who were totally healthy. They were 3 troublemaking 12-year-olds named Charlie, Henry, and Frank. That was not what Dr. Goldberger wanted to hear. If some of the kids eating this terrible diet were not getting the disease, then food had nothing to do with who got sick. The matron led the doctor outside to a courtyard where the 3 troublemaking boys were running around playing tag. None of them looked sick at all, even though they lived in a facility full of kids their age ravaged by disease. So what made these 3 special? Dr. Goldberger walked up to the 3 kids and asked how they'd been feeling lately. The boys looked at each other, confused by the question, then shrugged and ran off to continue their game. The doctor smiled. Disinterest was a normal reaction for happy, distracted kids. They clearly were not worried about their health. So the doctor thanked the matron and then headed back to his room, wondering if Charlie, Henry, and Frank held some secret to avoiding pellagra. And if they did, he desperately needed to know what it was. Dr. Goldberger stayed up late that night trying to solve the riddle of the 3 healthy boys. He combed through all the existing research on pellagra, searching for an answer for why they were not getting sick. He got so lost in thought that when he finally looked up, it was almost midnight. He decided a little breath of cool night air might help him sleep easier, so he got up and left the room. But just as he closed the door and stepped into the hallway, Dr. Goldberger heard hushed voices. In the otherwise silent orphanage, the sound echoed. He held his breath and listened. There they were again, whispers and then footsteps. The doctor tiptoed towards where the noise was coming from, and he peered around the corner just in time to see the doors to the cafeteria's kitchen swinging shut. The doctor crept along the hallway to the cafeteria entrance, and when he got there, he put his ear up to the door, and he could hear inside the cafeteria cupboards opening and excited voices muttering. The doctor peeked through the gap between the double doors, and he stifled a laugh. The three boys from earlier, Charlie, Henry, and Frank, were raiding the pantry. Dr. Goldberger was tempted to leave them be, but he realized that whatever they were eating might explain why they had not caught pellagra. So he slipped into the kitchen and cleared his throat. The boys instantly spun around, embarrassed looks all over their faces. They'd been caught red-handed, and there was no hiding it. But Dr. Goldberger immediately assured them that they were not in trouble. In fact, he said, they could actually be a big help to him. All he needed to know was what they were eating. If they told him, he'd go back to his room, and this could be their little secret. The boys exchanged confused glances, and then nodded to each other. They went to the pantry and pulled out the food they'd been stealing. A few peaches, a handful of peanuts, and some leftover chicken. Dr. Goldberger smiled, and then, in a conspiratorial whisper, asked them if they'd done this before. The boys' faces went red, and they looked down at their feet, and then one of them quietly admitted that yes, they had. Dr. Goldberger felt a surge of excitement. He thanked the boys for their honesty, then left them to their midnight snack. As the doctor headed back to his room, his mind spun with activity. He knew he was close to a breakthrough. By morning, he had devised a plan to test his theory. If it worked, he could finally solve the mystery of what was causing pellagra, and he could save countless lives. But Dr. Goldberger's experiment would take a little patience and more than a little danger for the people who actually took part in it. 8 months later, in February of 1915, on a pleasantly cool Mississippi morning, Dr. Goldberger stood outside of a brick building that looked just like a castle, complete with turrets and battlements. This would be his new home for the next 6 months, and where his grand experiment would take place, Rankin State Prison Farm. He needed a controlled environment for his test to be scientific, and this place was as controlled as it got. To date, there had been 0 cases of pellagra at this prison. But if the doctor's theory was correct, that would not be the case for much longer. Dr. Goldberger regretted what he was about to do. Pellagra killed about 1 out of every 30 people, and if he wasn't careful, his experiment could cost lives. But he didn't feel like he had a choice. People were counting on him. Already, dozens of his patients at the sanitarium and orphanage had died, and the pellagra outbreaks at those locations were not showing any signs of slowing down. So Dr. Goldberger went inside, and the warden then led him to the setting for his experiment, a prison within the prison. It was a private, newly built barracks with barred cells, a cafeteria, and a small screened-in yard. Throughout the experiment, the inmates here would have no contact with the rest of the prison population, so there could be no contamination. In exchange for agreeing to be a human guinea pig for 6 months, the 11 prisoners in the experiment would be given full pardons, $5, and a new suit. The warden then gave his sign to his staff, and the prisoners were brought in. 11 hardened men in pinstripe jumpsuits. Dr. Goldberger watched them file in for breakfast, taking a plate of food from the cafeteria workers and then settling in at a long table. Everyone was tense and alert, like nobody knew what to expect. But once they began eating, the mood turned festive. They cleared their plates, went for seconds, and cracked jokes about how lucky they were. This was a vacation compared to what they were used to. But Dr. Goldberger knew that if his experiment worked, the next 6 months would be anything but relaxing. Because if his suspicions were correct, then these men would contract pellagra and all the horrible suffering that came with it. Almost 6 months later, Dr. Goldberger woke early in his room at the prison and pulled out his calendar. It was the second week of September. The experiment's deadline was approaching fast, and he wasn't getting the results he had hoped for. In 6 weeks, all the funding for this would end, the barracks would be dismantled, and the prisoners would walk free. But there really was nothing Dr. Goldberger could do to make things move faster. The experiment had to move at its own pace. A few inmates had complained of some new ailments, headaches, backaches, dizziness, nausea, but they were nothing that could be pinpointed as pellagra. Just then, a guard knocked on the door and said there'd been an incident with one of the prisoners, who was now restrained in his cell and demanding to talk to the doctor. Dr. Goldberger followed the guard to the prisoner's cell, and as soon as the inmate caught sight of the doctor, the inmate began yelling. He called Dr. Goldberger a crook and shouted that he'd rather just serve his entire sentence back inside the regular prison than stay another second in this hell. Dr. Goldberger was not surprised. The joyful mood from the beginning of this experiment had totally worn off. Many of the inmates were grouchy and irritable, and he was getting yelled at a lot. Dr. Goldberger watched the prisoner thrash against his restraints and howl, when suddenly the doctor caught a glimpse of something through a tear in the prisoner's shoulder seam. The doctor called for the guards to come open up the cell, and then once they had, Dr. Goldberger rushed in and stretched that rip in the prisoner's shoulder even wider, and when he did, boom, there it was. A scaly rash stretching along the prisoner's shoulder blades and up around the base of his neck. Dr. Goldberger then pulled up the prisoner's shirt, and the man's torso was a trail of blackened rashes and pimply sores. There was no doubt this man had pellagra, and he didn't catch it from another prisoner or from the guards. This man must have gotten pellagra from Dr. Goldberger's experiment. Dr. Goldberger asked the guards to please send all the other inmates back to their cells. The doctor wanted to do a full-body checkup on each of them. Once all the prisoners were ready, Dr. Goldberger slowly walked along the cell block, scanning each prisoner from head to toe, and as he did, his pen was a blur in his notebook, furiously scribbling detailed descriptions. The doctor couldn't believe what he was seeing. His hands were shaking. 5 more men had clear symptoms of pellagra, meaning 6 out of the 11 volunteers had caught the deadly disease. Dr. Goldberger dashed back to his office and quickly sent word to the governor. His experiment had worked. Now it was time to tell the world. What Dr. Goldberger had discovered was shockingly simple. Pellagra was not caused by black flies transmitting a virus or bacteria, and pellagra was not contagious. Pellagra was caused by food. Specifically, it was caused by the traditional American Southern diet in poor households: salt pork, molasses, and cornmeal. If that was all somebody ate, it was highly likely they would get pellagra. And people who supplemented this traditional Southern diet with things like milk and vegetables and fresh meat would not get pellagra. Once these results were published, there were mixed reactions from the scientific community. Some wanted to nominate Dr. Goldberger for a Nobel Prize, but just as many doubted the experiment's results, in particular doctors and officials who lived in the American South. They felt like this northern doctor was criticizing their entire way of life. Dr. Goldberger was frustrated that people were questioning his discovery. After all, he had proven it with the experiment he ran at the prison. The prisoners who had volunteered to be a part of it had followed a strict diet of biscuits, gravy, cornbread, grits, rice, syrup, collard greens, and yams. They could eat as much of these foods as they wanted, but no other types of food. And this diet is what caused half of the prisoners to develop pellagra, just like the residents of the Georgia State Sanitarium for the Insane and the children between the ages of 6 and 12 at the orphanage. They all got pellagra from their diet. Still, while Dr. Goldberger had proven that a better, more varied diet was enough to prevent pellagra, he had not actually figured out why that was. It would take another 20 years until scientists actually proved what caused pellagra. It is caused from a deficiency of vitamin B3, also known as niacin. The traditional post-Civil War Southern diet of dried meat, molasses, and cornmeal severely lacked this nutrient, which is why the region was hit so much harder than other areas in America. But once people started adding niacin back into their diet, mostly in the form of enriched flour, the disease no longer manifested, and almost everyone already suffering from it recovered. All told, over 100,000 people died of pellagra between 1900 and 1940 until it disappeared with the identification of niacin. Sadly, Dr. Goldberger died before this discovery of an unrelated and extremely rare form of cancer. However, Dr. Goldberger will always be remembered because he was the one who cracked the riddle of pellagra and saved tens of thousands of lives.
In 1985, the remote and extremely dangerous west face of the Ciula Grande in the Peruvian Andes was still unclimbed. But in 1985, two very ambitious climbers, 25-year-old Joe Simpson and 21-year-old Simon Yates, decided they were going to be the first to conquer it. And by all accounts, they seemed up for the job, having already conquered numerous difficult Scottish ice cliffs, as well as a number of large mountain faces in the Alps. So, in early June of that year, the pair flew to Peru, and they arrived at the base camp that was nearest to the Ciula Grande, but it was still 5 miles away, so they couldn't actually see what they were going to be climbing yet. On June 5th, when the weather was good enough, the pair left camp and worked their way around the huge lake across the glacier to the base of this cliff they're about to climb, and when they saw it for the first time, they couldn't believe how steep and dangerous it looked. But over the next 3 days, they managed to make it up this cliff despite a blizzard hitting them halfway through, and they reached the summit. To them, this was a crowning achievement. They had done it. They had written their names in the history books. But in reality, the thing that people would remember them for was not for reaching the top of Ciula Grande. It was for what happened when they started going down. Because of how steep this mountain was, and because of the blizzard that was not going away, it was actually getting worse, the descent was going to be much more challenging than the ascent. So shortly after 10 a.m. on June 8th, Joe and Simon left the summit and began very carefully making their way down the mountain. At 11 a.m., disaster struck when Joe lost his footing and fell to the bottom of an ice cliff and shattered his leg. Initially, they both assumed this was a death sentence for Joe, because there's no way he can actually climb down the mountain now, and certainly Simon can't actually carry him down the mountain. They were so high up, and it's so steep, there's just no way. But Simon wanted to at least try to save his friend, so he climbed down to him, he gave him some mild painkillers that he had, and then he attached his rope to Joe, and then Simon anchored himself in the snow, and he began lowering Joe down the mountain, all 300 feet of his rope, and when he would stop, Joe at the other end would anchor himself in the snow with his ice picks, and then Simon would climb down to Joe and he'd repeat the process, over and over and over again, lowering Joe 300 feet at a time. This went on for hours and hours and hours, just back-breaking work for Simon, and Joe, meanwhile, is in excruciating pain from his broken leg. And to make matters worse, the storm had gotten so bad that the visibility between Simon and Joe was zero. So as Simon is lowering Joe, he can't see what he's lowering Joe onto, but they had no other choice. That was the only way they could get him down. And so at 5 p.m. that night, Simon accidentally lowers Joe over a cliff. And Joe, as soon as he's hanging off the edge, all of his weight is on the rope, and suddenly the rope is flying out of Simon's hands, and he manages to self-arrest and stop him from careening over the edge. But now, Simon is the only thing holding Joe from tumbling to his death. And Simon is being slowly drugged down the mountain. He can't anchor himself in. And so they're in the middle of this inhospitable environment. In the middle of the night, a storm is raging. It's freezing cold. They can't communicate with each other. They can't hear each other or see each other. And Simon is just hoping that Joe is going to be able to grab onto something and kind of take his weight off the rope. Otherwise, this is going to end badly for both of them. But unfortunately, the cliff was at an angle, so Joe was dangling off of it and he couldn't touch the wall. He had nothing to grab onto. He was just dangling in the air. And so as Simon tries to move the rope to try to signal to Joe to take your weight off the rope, Joe is trying to climb up the rope, but his hands are starting to get frostbit. He's weak, he's in pain, he can't do anything about it. So for the next 2.5 hours, Simon is desperately trying to regain an anchor in the snow, but every second that goes by, he's getting pulled farther and farther and farther down the mountain. He can't see how close he is to the edge. He knows he's getting close. And so finally, at 7:30 p.m., with no other option, he pulls out a knife and he cuts the rope. As soon as the rope was cut, Simon fell backwards. He was safe. Nothing was pulling him off the cliff any longer, but he knew he had just sent Joe to his death. Except Joe didn't die. When that rope was cut, he fell 150 feet and smashed into the ground, except what he hit was a thin sheet of ice that broke from his weight, and he fell another 80 feet into this massive ice crevasse. Joe was knocked unconscious from the fall, but when he woke up, he was laying on his side. He opened his eyes and he looked around and he couldn't believe he was alive. And he's looking around, he doesn't know where he is, it's totally dark. He turns on his headlamp and he realizes he's fallen into an ice crevasse, and he looks down and he's on this little ledge that's overlooking a much, much deeper fall. He looks down and this ice crevasse seems to just go on infinitely into this black chasm. And he realizes when he fell, had he fallen a foot over, that's where he would have gone. So it's a miracle he's alive, but now he's trapped in the middle of an ice crevasse 80 feet down. He can't go down and he can't go up. At the time, Joe didn't know if Simon had fallen off the cliff with him or if he had cut the rope. But the rope was still attached to his waist and it fed up and out of the ice crevasse, and so he grabbed it and pulled on it until it all came tumbling back down and he saw it was frayed, and so sure enough, Simon had cut the rope. Now, even though Joe wasn't mad at Simon for the decision he made because he understood it was the right one, Joe still became very emotional when he saw this. He felt so alone, he was so sad, and for a little while he just kind of freaked out and screamed and yelled and really just didn't know what he was going to do. And then after that, he sat down knowing he wasn't getting out of here and that he was going to die a slow, horrible, painful death. Joe remembers reaching up and turning off his headlamp, which retrospectively he thought was kind of goofy because he's just realized he's about to die inside of this crevasse and he's saving batteries. But with the light off, he's sitting on the ledge and he hears all the sounds that are coming from inside of this crevasse. It was this awful grinding sound, like a moaning sound, that he said it was so terrifying sitting in the darkness listening to this sound that he reached up and turned his light back on just for comfort. Back up on the mountain, Simon was devastated. He felt like he had just killed his friend, and even though he understood why he did it and understood it was probably the right decision, it didn't change the fact that he felt incredibly guilty about it. And so that night, he didn't even move from the position he was. He dug a little snow cave and he laid down and eventually fell asleep. The next morning when he got up, he began moving his way down the mountain, and he finally rounded the area where Joe had been hanging off of that cliff, and he got a chance to look down and see where Joe might have wound up. And to his horror, he's looking down and he sees this massive opening to a crevasse that seemed almost bottomless. And now this confirms that Joe definitely has died because he fell in there. But nonetheless, Simon goes down and goes to the edge of the crevasse and yells into Joe. He's screaming for him to call out if he's still alive. But after a while, he never heard anything from Joe. And with a heavy heart, Simon turned around and started heading back to base camp. A little while after Simon had left, Joe finally woke up. He had been asleep when Simon was yelling down for him. And so Joe wakes up, he's looking around, he can't believe this wasn't a bad dream. He starts yelling for Simon because he doesn't know what else to do. But after a while, he realized Simon's not going to come down here to get me. He cut the rope. He thinks I'm dead already. At this point, Joe decides he needs to try to climb out of the crevasse, even with a broken leg. And so he gets himself in position, he gets his ice picks, and he starts making his way up this ice wall, but he can't put any weight on his broken leg, and he keeps falling down, and he's realizing, I can't climb this. I probably couldn't climb this with two good legs, let alone with this broken one. And so Joe had two choices. He could wait on the ledge and hope to be rescued, but by his calculations, it was unlikely someone was going to come out here and rescue him anytime soon because Simon is going to say he's dead. So wait on the ledge and probably die a slow, painful death, or he can go down deeper into the crevasse, which he has no idea where it goes, and hope somewhere down in that black void there's an opening that leads back out to the outside of the mountain. So he made his choice, screwed an anchor into the ice, put his rope through it, he tested it to make sure it would hold his weight, he looked down into the void one last time and knew that as soon as he stepped off of this ledge, he could not come back up again. This was a one-way trip. And if he made it to the bottom of his 300-foot rope and he didn't find a ledge or a tunnel or something to put his feet on, he would slip off and fall to his death. On purpose, he did not put a knot at the end of his rope because he figured either I'll find a way out or I won't, but at least it'll be quick. Down he went about 80 feet into this pitch black crevasse. He has no idea what's down there. And he gets to a point where the walls kind of come together and he was able to squeeze through it. And he realized once he got through that point, it was like the center of an hourglass where below it, it kind of opened up. And as soon as he pushed through, he could actually see to the ground. He saw flat ground and there was light shining on it, which meant there was a hole leading out into the mountains somewhere down there. And so he went all the way down, he touched the bottom, it was solid ground, he disconnected from his rope, and he climbed his way up this incline to where the sun was coming in, which was this hole that led right back out onto the mountain. And sure enough, He crawled out and tumbled out, and the sun is shining on him, and he remembers just laying on the mountain looking at the sun and laughing. He couldn't believe it. But after the initial relief of not dying wore off, he realized he was not out of the woods yet. He still needed to climb down the rest of the mountain, and there wasn't that much left to climb. He was towards the bottom, and it wasn't that steep. But after that, he would need to navigate 5 miles back to base camp. But over several delirious, painful, miserable days, he managed to crawl all the way back to base camp, and he got there right as Simon was packing up the tent and getting ready to leave. He could not believe he saw Joe alive. Joe said Simon just swore. He just endlessly swore. He was cussing. He couldn't even speak. He didn't understand. It was like he was looking at a ghost. But after that kind of crazy initial interaction, Simon just gave Joe a big hug, and Joe and Simon just cried and held each other. Joe underwent 6 surgical operations to repair the damage done to his leg, and doctors would tell him that you're never going to climb again, and you're probably going to struggle with walking for the rest of your life. But after 2 years of intense rehabilitation, Joe was not only walking just fine, he was mountain climbing. As for Simon, he managed to leave the mountain without any serious physical injury, but he carried with him an enormous sense of guilt that he still carries today. Joe consistently says Simon made the right decision. In every interview he does, he always makes sure to say, Simon is not at fault. It was an impossible situation. He made the right call. Joe wrote a book about the experience called Touching the Void, and it sold millions of copies worldwide and has since been adapted into a major motion picture. As for Joe and Simon, apparently they've drifted apart over the years, but they still consider each other friends.
Our next story is called Bats.
In 1994, 39-year-old Mauro Prosperi took part in the brutal Marathon des Sables, which is a 6-day endurance race covering 155 miles through the Sahara Desert. The competition was known as one of the toughest in the world, but Prosperi was a former Olympic athlete, and he kept himself in unbelievable physical shape. He was also a police officer back in Italy, which kept him even more active, so he felt ready. The competition's desert terrain was so dangerous that participants had to indicate where they wanted their bodies sent if they did not survive the race. In preparation for the race, Prosperi would run 25 miles a day for weeks leading up to it, and he would give himself less and less water as he was running to get accustomed to dehydration. But despite how much he was training and his incredible athletic resume that showed he's someone that can probably do this, his wife was very concerned. But he would tell her, the worst thing that's going to happen to me is I'll get a little sunburned. The race kicked off at its starting point in Morocco on April 10th, and initially it was going very smoothly. Prosperi was always at the front of the pack, and he was always the first Italian to finish that day's stage. And so when he would finish, he would go to his tent and he'd put an Italian flag on the outside to show the other Italians doing the race where they could find him to come inside and chat. And he would say that part of the race was really fun. Then things went wrong on the 4th day during the longest and most difficult phase of the race. When he set out that morning, it was already very windy, and he found himself in this section between these 2 big sand dunes, and the pace setters had already gone way ahead, so he's totally alone. And then out of nowhere, this massive sandstorm kicks up and completely blinds him. He can't go anywhere because he can't see where he's going, and so he manages to kind of feel his way to this rock, where he gets down behind this rock, and he thinks to himself, I'll just wait it out and then continue on. But the sandstorm raged for 8 hours. And when it was finally done, it was totally dark outside, so Prosperi couldn't see anything. So he decides, I'm gonna have to sleep on the dunes, and tomorrow morning I'll have to get up and keep going. And his biggest concern at this point was not that he was in a survival situation. It was, I was in 4th place in this race, and now with this huge setback, I'm probably gonna finish last. And so when he went to sleep that night, all he was thinking about is, I gotta get up and go as fast as I can so I don't finish last tomorrow. But when the sun came up the next morning, Prosperi looked around and he realized he had a much bigger problem. The sandstorm had been so strong, it had completely altered the landscape. The dunes had all moved around. He had no points of reference. And so even though he had a map and he had a compass, he had no way to orient himself. So he had no idea what direction to go. Anybody that competed in this race really needed to be self-sufficient. And so Prosperi had a knife, he had plenty of dehydrated food, he had a sleeping bag, but he had very little water. He had about a half bottle of water. Because at each of the checkpoints during the day, the race officials would give you all of this water, and the idea was you would drink it all by the time you got to your next checkpoint. And he had not made it to the next checkpoint, and so was very low on water. As he's looking around, realizing this is a really bad situation, he thinks to himself, other runners must have had this same thing happen to them. They probably had to hunker down yesterday during the sandstorm and they're just waking up now. They're looking around. I'm bound to find someone. We'll link up and we will get to the end of this race and we'll be just fine. And so he runs to the top of a sand dune and looks around expecting to see someone, and he doesn't. There's no one in all directions. It's just completely barren desert. And so he leaves that sand dune, goes up another one and does the same thing. He's looking around and there's nobody there. And over the course of several hours, he was just running to the peaks of these different sand dunes, expecting to see someone, not seeing anyone, becoming more panicked and expending more energy. And finally, by the late afternoon, when he's sweating profusely and the sun is bearing down on him and he still hasn't seen anyone, he realizes he's going to die if he keeps doing this. And he needs to be smart about this. And so at this point, he went into survival mode, and he decided that the only times he's going to move are going to be at night and in the early morning hours, because those are the times when the sun is not up and it's still pretty cool, and he can conserve energy that way. He also began peeing into bottles and began conserving his urine to drink later when he did run out of water. And so over the next 2 days, he conserved his energy, but he was just kind of drifting through the desert and he wasn't really getting anywhere. He didn't know if he was making progress because he had nothing to go to. He wasn't seeing anyone, and he was starting to realize the situation is getting worse and worse by the minute. And then, in an incredible stroke of luck, he comes across this Muslim shrine in the middle of nowhere that Bedouins would use as they traveled across the desert, and he ran inside hoping that there'd be a person in there. And there was a person in there, but they were dead inside of a coffin. But he was happy that he now had shelter over his head, and this felt like progress. He began taking stock of his new surroundings, and when he was inside the shrine looking up into the ceiling, he saw it was lined with hundreds of bats. And at this point, he's really hungry, he's really thirsty, and so he climbed up into the rafters and began grabbing handfuls of bats and drinking their blood. After drinking the blood of 20 bats, he used some of the wood that was inside of the shrine, and he built a fire outside, and that would be his way to signal planes and helicopters going overhead that he assumed would be out looking for him. And so he sets the fire and he comes back inside expecting, over the next couple of days, someone's bound to find him, but nobody does. And 4 days go by and 3 separate times a plane or a helicopter flew directly over him. He's got his fire going, he's out there flagging him down, but nobody saw him. And so at the end of those 4 days, he's now been out in the desert roaming around for nearly a week, and he's starting to realize that this is the end. He's not going to survive this. No one knows where he is. No one's seen him so far. He's running out of supplies. This is it. And so knowing he was staring down a long, painful death, either by dehydration or starvation, he decided he was going to expedite it. And he would say later that he did not feel sad about this. It just was a logical choice he was making. He figured this way, if he died inside of the shrine was more likely to be found than if he had died somewhere out in the desert where sand would cover him up. And so he said it was more likely people would find the shrine and therefore find him, and so there'd be closure for his family. And so Prosperi took a piece of charcoal from the fire, wrote a message to his wife, and then cut his wrists and laid down, expecting never to wake up again. But the next morning, he woke up. And he had barely bled because his blood was too thick. He literally could not bleed to death. He took this as a sign that he was supposed to live, and he suddenly felt motivated to survive. He decided to leave the shrine and follow the advice that one of the race organizers had given all of them at the start, which was, if you get lost, follow the clouds you can see just beyond the horizon at dawn. There you will find civilization. So Prosperi hopped up and began heading towards what he believed were those clouds. He walked for days in the desert, grabbing snakes and lizards off the ground and eating them raw. He said his inner caveman came out, like his primal desire to live, and he had no problems eating the things he was eating. Prosperi grew so dehydrated he couldn't even urinate anymore, so he began drinking the liquid inside of succulents that grew inside of dried up riverbeds, and he also began sucking out the moisture in his wet wipes that were in his backpack. On the 9th day, Prosperi saw a little shepherd girl off in the distance, and she saw him, and she was scared of him, and she turned and ran away. And at first, Prosperi is devastated because he has no strength to chase after her, but she had actually gone down to her tribe and told them about this strange man wandering the desert, and they came running up over the dunes, and they brought him in, and they gave him food and drink, and they sent someone to get police. After police picked him up and brought him back to their headquarters, he discovered he had walked over 181 miles from where he had gotten lost on the course all the way to Algeria. His family and race organizers had gone out looking for him after he went missing, but all they ever found was his shoelace, and so they assumed he was dead. It would take him 2 years to fully recover from this ordeal, but after he did, he went on to run 8 more desert races.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Head in the Clouds.
In 2007, 35-year-old Eva Wisniewska was a member of the German national paragliding team. Over the previous 2 years, Eva had competed in 10 of the world's biggest paragliding competitions, and she had won 6 of them, making her the top female paraglider in the world. So coming into that year, Eva was very motivated to work extra hard to make sure she retained that title as world champion. On February 24th of that year, Eva was preparing her gear alongside 200 other paragliders on Mount Bora in New South Wales, Australia. This was Eva's last training opportunity before her first major competition of that year, which was scheduled for the next week. As they were getting ready to launch, one of the coaches walked in front of the group and made an announcement. He said storm clouds had been spotted to the north, but the forecast was a little bit ambiguous. It wasn't clear if the storm was going to move over their training area or not. So it was up to each of the paragliders if they still wanted to launch that day and risk the bad weather. Eva, who was really eager to get this training flight in, looked at the sky and saw that it was pretty gray, but decided that she was going to do it. Worst case scenario, she would have to cut it short. The rest of the German national team, they didn't want to take the risk, and so they stayed grounded that day. Eva took a little bit longer preparing her gear, so by the time she was lining up on the cliff, she was only one of a handful of people that remained. And so strapped into her glider, she took a good run forward and launched herself up into the air. On the ground, the rest of the German national team followed in a van to track her progress and checked in with her from time to time with their radio. The first part of Eva's journey was incredibly calm. She followed the ridgeline from Mount Bora for 12 miles until it ended. At that point, she entered into the skies over the vast savanna. As her GPS and tracking log ticked, tracking her progress, 2 large thunderstorm clouds appeared in front of her, one larger than the other. The vast majority of the other paragliders that had launched that day had launched ahead of Eva, and so when these clouds appeared, they had already passed that section, and so they didn't need to contend with the storm. As for Eva and the other 2 people she was with, which was an Austrian team member and a Chinese team member, they had a decision to make. They could either immediately ground their flight to avoid the storm, or they could attempt to dodge it. They chose the latter. They knew it was too dangerous to try to fly underneath these clouds because of something called updraft. At the beginning of storms, warm air is sucked up from the ground up into these clouds, and a paraglider, if they get caught in that, can get sucked up with the air into the storm. And so Eva and the other 2 paragliders began aggressively flying around the outside of these clouds when all of a sudden the storm completely changed. The big cloud overtook the small cloud, creating this 12-mile wide cumulonimbus cloud that now all 3 paragliders were stuck inside of. Any updraft is dangerous to a paraglider, but the updraft of a cumulonimbus cloud is famously dangerous because it's extremely powerful and it lasts for over an hour. The Austrian man was able to pull down on one toggle, point his feet, and begin spiraling all the way out of the grasp of this updraft. And he said he turned to look at the other 2, and he didn't see the Chinese man, but he did see Eva, and she was desperately trying to do what he was doing and spiral down, but she was clearly caught in the updraft, and he watched her get pulled up into the black cloud out of view. By the time the Austrian man hit the ground, he would say it had become the worst thunderstorm he had ever seen, with huge hail balls hitting the ground all around him. He took one more look up and he didn't see the Chinese man, he didn't see Eva anywhere, and he took off running for a barn to seek shelter. And when he was there, he pulled out his radio and he alerted the other teams of this emergency. Inside the cloud, Eva was hurtling up like a rocket. The storm was lifting her at a rate of 60 feet per second. There was nothing she could do to get out of this wind tunnel. Ava knew she was getting pulled towards the storm's eye in its vicious center because of the immense claps of thunder that just kept getting louder and louder, and it also kept getting darker and darker all around her. In fact, it was pitch black except for the occasional flash of lightning that came very close to electrocuting her. As she desperately tried to keep her glider stable, she was able to place a radio call down to her team on the ground, but all she could say was, "I can't see anything," before it cut out. And at some point, Ava reached the eye of the storm where it's pitch black and the temperatures are freezing and hail balls the size of oranges are pelting her left and right. And the updraft kept pulling her higher and higher and higher until she passed out from a lack of oxygen. And at some point, this updraft actually shot her up and out of the cloud. And while this meant she was out of the storm, she was now in air that was 50 degrees below zero, which meant everything, her face, her gloves, her clothes, the wings of her glider, everything completely froze. And to make matters worse, at the altitude she was at, there was almost no oxygen and she did not have a breathing apparatus. So by all accounts, Ava should be dead. But somehow, she didn't die. She just kept floating around above this storm cloud for 45 minutes. And then something happened. The ice on one side of the glider broke off, causing it to collapse, throwing her into a deadly free fall, and she's not in control, she's still unconscious, and she starts barreling back towards the ground like gravity has been turned back on again, going straight through the storm all over again. And so through the storm, going at 90 feet per second, she clears the storm, and then right after getting out from underneath it, her glider miraculously just opens back up again. And the jerking motion of her suddenly stopping her free fall jolted her awake. And so she's looking around, totally confused as she's gradually regaining consciousness, and she's taking stock of where she is, and she's still in the storm cloud, but right at the bottom of it. But luckily, the updraft had stopped. And so she was steady, and she was able to reach up and grab her toggles, and she was able to fly herself down to the ground and crash land, and then she curled into a ball, grabbed her radio, and she called her team. When they heard her voice, they could not believe she was alive because the other paraglider that got sucked up by the updraft, the guy from the Chinese national team, he unfortunately was struck by lightning and was killed. And so they were anticipating finding out that Ava had been struck by lightning as well. But Ava had not just survived. When they brought her to the hospital, they discovered that virtually nothing was wrong with her. She had some pretty bad bruises and cuts from the hail, and she had a little bit of frostbite on her face, but it was treatable. And so the same day she was brought in, they discharged her. After leaving the hospital, she and her teammates went back to the launch site so she could collect her gear. And when they got there, she looked at her GPS, and the GPS had been tracking her entire flight the entire time she was up in that cloud. And she showed her teammates what it said, and they literally couldn't believe it. The screen showed she had reached an altitude of 32,634 feet, which, to put this in perspective, is the same altitude you fly at inside of a commercial jet. So imagine being outside of your plane in the middle of a flight, and that's how high she was. Another reference point is she was approximately 4,000 feet higher than the summit of Mount Everest. No human being had ever been that high, unprotected, and lived to tell the tale, until Ava.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please secretly follow the Amazon Music follow button into a grocery store and then ram the back of their heels with your cart. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mr. Ballin Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballin Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any